Okay, this portion of the calling is going to be on, I only have 3 grunt calls here. I've probably owned a dozen in my life, but I've gotten rid of them. Grunt calls, going to have some Doe Bleats, going to do some vocal Doe Bleat, Doe mats. Also have a fawn in distress, and I also have what I use if I'm trying to call in a coyote. If I'm out west and I'm hunting and I see a coyote, I'll try and call him in and shoot him. I've shot, I think, 4 coyotes with my bow deer hunting. I won't do it in Michigan, but I will do it when I'm out west because I know I'm going to get an opportunity no matter what out there. Okay, but anyway, on grunt calls, this here is an exhale call. Somebody sent me this one. They sent me a couple of these a few years ago, and it actually has an adjustment, this little dial here. Now, I don't personally care for that because if I'm going to use an exhale grunt call, typically I'm going to have my hand cupped over the end, so it sounds a little bit more realistic. But anyway, I just thought I'd show you that, because most grunt calls sound relatively similar to each other. Now, this is an old MAD. This is a grunt wheeze call. In fact, I think it was an MD407, if I'm not mistaken. That was the model number. And this one here has a wheeze. And that's a very, typically if you're going to hear a wheeze, that's going to be from a relatively dominant buck. I did one time have a 6-point come into a primary scrape area and do a snort wheeze, which I thought that was really rare because it was definitely a 1.5-year old deer. It wasn't like an old 6-point, it was a 1.5-year old buck. But usually it's an older buck that's going to do a wheeze because that's a real dominance call. In 2000, actually it was 1999, I was hunting on the edge of a bedding area in a transition zone, and a buck actually came through. I was on by a primary scrape area. He went into the bedding area, and then I could hear him. He wasn't a shooter. I could hear him sparring with a couple other bucks, or another buck. And when they quit sparring, I don't know which one of them did the wheeze. Might have been the one that he was fighting with, but you know, he did a, and then it was over. That was his, like, I'm the dominant guy, get the hell out of Dodge. And I never heard any sparring beyond that. But this one's a really good exhale. This has an exhale grunt on it, and I use that if I'm gonna call something and it's at a distance, or if I'm just gonna cold call, do a cold grunt call where I'm not visually seeing anything, I'll use this exhale call because it's relatively loud. And one thing when you're doing grunts, don't do them, I'm not going to say don't do them like you see on TV, because some guys on TV actually do know how to use a grunt call, but I hear so many times this. That lengthy, like it's a sheep. Bucks, when they're walking through the woods, when they're grunting, you know, they're usually on a doe or they're looking for an estrus doe. It's typically during pre-rut or during peak rut, and it's very short and blunt and to the point. And usually they'll make a grunt, 3-4 seconds later they'll grunt again, and usually it's while they're moving through an area or they're coming into a primary scrape area or something like that. But I like the exhale because I can hear it I can make it a call where I can, if I see something at 150 yards away, you know, when the foliage is down, I can see long ways in the swamp or whatever. You know, I'll do a grunt call or I'll do a rattle sequence, and then if I get some sort of a commitment where they're moving towards me, I'll quit doing any more rattle sequences, I'll use a grunt call. But my favorite, by far, is this one. This here was the actual mouthpiece was an old Eddie Salter call. It's probably at least 30 years old. And this is an inhale, but I put it in a different cup. I put it in a cup that gives it a better sound. So this one's really soft, and I've used this one when I've actually seen bucks relatively close, and I just do a soft grunt. Just something like that, and real short and abrupt. And you know, I've had them come in. And again, this is the call I used when I was rattling in those 2 bucks, and they hung up underneath an oak tree. And then they started going in a different direction. I couldn't rattle anymore, so I took out this inhale call, because that could be one deer where you know, they're going to commit to coming in to look for one deer if they're behind some brush. But if I'm rattling, they're going to have to visually see the 2 bucks moving around to commit to coming into. So this here, it would not be my cold call. You know, I wouldn't use the inhale for a cold calling because it doesn't have enough volume. But when something's relatively close and it's not coming into me, never hurts to give it a grunt call. Just a nice soft inhale grunt. If I had an option of buying an inhale grunt, if I was just going to have one, an inhale or an exhale, it would definitely be an inhale. They're much, much harder to find. I really don't know who makes them anymore. Who would you say, Joe?
Shoepex has an inhale grunt call available now.
Okay, there's a store, Shoebox Sporting Goods in Michigan. I guess they sell an inhale grunt call, but they're really, really hard to find. Okay, so much for grunt calls. But I guess I should say when grunt calls work good, primarily they work best during pre-rut and during the rut. Bucks don't do a lot of grunting until they're actually pursuing or chasing, or you know, they're with a hot doe, or they're searching for the next hot doe. That's when they will typically do grunts, and that's when obviously they're more apt to come in to a grunt because maybe the buck that's grunting is with a doe, and maybe another one could come into it and take that doe over if he's more dominant. So again, when, where, and how is a big deal, just like rattling. And typically where, to me, whether I'm rattling, any kind of calling, it's got to be within some semblance of security cover, which is basically all I hunt anyway. Every place I hunt has perimeter security cover and, you know, good transition security cover to a bedding area, or I'm within a bedding area. So everything is security cover oriented. Okay, the next calls I'm going to talk about are going to be Doe Bleats. Now, what I've done as far as Doe Bleats more than anything is just a vocal meh, meh. Now, I have never shot at a buck while it was walking, ever. And I've shot well over 100 bucks with my bow. If I see a buck, and if a buck's coming by and he's walking, I'll just draw my bow, meh, meh. Just do a little vocal. Basically, you stick your tongue up on behind your teeth, and just suck in some air. Meh, meh. And that'll stop them almost every time. You do not do a grunt call when you're trying to stop a deer. You know, I've watched professional guys on TV hit a grunt call to stop a deer while they're taking a shot. A grunt call to a buck is a confrontational call. So there's an excellent chance if you hit a grunt call trying to stop a deer for a shot, there's an excellent chance, because it's a confrontational, it's another buck, he may turn and face the tree. Then you've got a straightforward shot. So you always do something that's non-confrontational. That's why you do a doe mat as opposed to something that's buck oriented. Now, this one here, this goes off easy, obviously. This here is a Doe Bleat, and I don't remember where I found this, but it was 55 bucks, and I keep this in my pack, and it works really simple. You just tap on it, and there's a setting inside for how hard you got to tap to set it off. It's battery powered, obviously, and it's just a nice volume, and it's just got the length of it's nice, and the tone of it's nice. So this one, if you Google it, you might find it. It was actually designed to go on a bow. So the reason this thing was made was really, really, really stupid. Basically, this was supposed to go in your stabilizer. It's threaded into your stabilizer, and then when you shoot at a deer, this went off by the jar of the bow. And then if you missed, supposedly that's supposed to make the deer feel comfortable because the noise came from a doe, and he would stay there and you could reload and get a second shot. So that's a pretty ridiculous thing to have on a bow, because first of all, how often do you miss a deer? That doesn't happen very often. But anyway, this here, I keep this, and it's got a good volume, so it's good for a long distance. And this is something I would use for cold calling does. If I wanted to just do a Doe Bleat, this is what I'd use, because it's got a pretty good distance. And it goes off real easy. Now this here, this is just a basic can. Now this one here happens to be a Quaker boy, Bleat and heat. Primo's makes one too. To me, because I have a little bit of a tremor, this works better if I hold it up and just blow in it. So this works really well if you blow it, but you got to hold it up above, about a 45-degree angle upward, because this is designed to go off. There's a weight in there, so that weight has to be back against the side you're blowing into for this to work. And then this here is also a Quaker boy. They don't make this one anymore, but it's called a squeeze and bleat. Now I took this thing off because I didn't care for it, and I use this the same way. But this one here, you don't have to hold it up at 45 degrees. You can put this any direction. Just got a really nice tone. And again, that was Quaker Boy Squeeze and Bleat, and I just take the can off the end of the squeeze tube. Now this one was something that's supposed to be a doe bellow. I bought this, I didn't. Somebody told me it worked good for him once, so I tried it. And I've never heard this in the woods. I've heard does bleat and fawns bleat hundreds of times, but I've never heard this noise, and this is the way it's supposed to sound. It's supposed to do an inhale short for a quarter second and then an exhale. That's supposed to be the sound a doe makes when she's hot, but I have personally never heard it. So I just don't like the two different tones, because I've never heard does do two different tones in the same syllable, if you will. Okay, now this one here is a fawn in distress. It sounds a little bit like a rabbit call, but it's actually a fawn distress call. And I actually called in a buck with this because I saw a buck with a hot doe. She was definitely hot, and she was trying to get rid of him. So she was either out just leaving her estrus cycle or just coming into it, because they hadn't I don't think they had bred yet, but she was really close to her cycle. And they were about 150 yards away, not coming in my direction. So and there was a lot of brush between me and them. I could see them, but they couldn't see the ground below where I was hunting. So the first thing I obviously tried was a rattling sequence. He turned and looked in my direction, but he's not leaving that doe. He just was not going to leave that doe. So, you know, they kept doing what they were doing, and they were continuing to move away from me. Well, then I hit a Doe Bleat, a doe can, like I just did. And that didn't do anything either, because why would he leave a hot doe for just a doe that he has no idea what she's in, or if it's a fawn or whatever. So that didn't do anything either. Again, he looked my direction, but he didn't come. So I'm like, okay, now what am I going to do? Because they are not coming my direction. They're headed towards a crop field about a quarter mile away. So I took out a fawn in distress call. I just did a few of those, just about that much right there. And that doe turned around and she trotted all the way over to where I was at. And guess who came with her? The buck did, and I shot him at about 5 yards. And she came, it was kind of interesting because from that distance, she had keyed on that noise so well. And that happens when you're rattling or doing any kind of calling. Even if they're a couple hundred yards away, it's almost like they got an internal GPS, because they can come right to that spot. I even called an elk in. I did some cow calls while I was hunting out of a saddle and for elk. And I did some cow calls, and I had a bull elk, a 5x5, come up and stop right at the base of my tree and looking around for what it was. And so it's just amazing how animals can key in on a vocal sound from a distance right to that pinpoint spot. But this worked great. That's the only time I've actually used this fawn in distress call, but it worked perfect, and I will hopefully sometime use that again. Now this is it's called the Little Rascal. This is also supposed to be a rabbit call. And I use this because it's got a really small tone to it. If I'm hunting out west, I'll use this if I see a coyote at a distance to try and call him in. And it'll be just something really short and soft. Just no louder than that, because a coyote can be 150 yards away. If it's pretty calm, he's going to hear that. If not, you just raise the volume a little bit. So coyotes typically, especially out west where there's lots of coyotes and no hunting pressure, you can call them in from a long distance. And again, I'd never shoot a coyote when I'm hunting in Michigan, if I'm hunting at a spot where I think I might have an opportunity to mature buck. But out west, there's so many mature bucks. If I get a chance to shoot a coyote, and there's so many dang coyotes out there, it's just predator rich out there. I can shoot a coyote and I still don't really have to worry about a buck coming in that same evening or that same morning. They still will come in because not much bothers those deer out there. So I think we covered that. So we got the coyote, which is what I use as a mouse call, the fawn, inhale, exhale, grunts. I also use these when I'm using decoys. I will use these in conjunction with it. Because a lot of times if a deer's coming at a distance, they don't particularly see your decoy. So if you make some sort of a sound just to get them to look in that direction, then they'll pick up the decoy and come into the decoy. So you can use this in conjunction with a decoy. You can use grunt calls in conjunction with rattling. If you do a rattle sequence and a buck comes in and he hangs up because he can't see two animals moving around, yet there's ample security cover between you and the deer on the ground, then hit a grunt call. He might come in, or hit a doe bleat. During when does are hot, he might come into that. But he's more apt to come into something like that because they could be standing stationary and he can't physically see them. Whereas if two bucks are sparring, obviously they are moving and he'd be able to pick that visual up. So use calls in conjunction with decoys, rattling, obviously visuals, and in certain areas, cold calling works well as well. Cold calling is where you don't see anything. You're just, every 2 hours, you hit a cold call. Maybe a grunt call, 2 or 3 grunts. Again, rattling sequences. I cold call when I'm in bedding areas during pre-rut and rut phases 3 or 4 times during the day on an all-day sit, or sometimes just if I'm on a evening sit and I got a lot of security cover around me, I'll do a rattle sequence just before dark. But I always, same thing with calling, with grunts and all that stuff, always let a destination location, if it's a massed fruit trees, primary scrape area, pinch point between some timber and a feeding area that's got good ample security cover, always allow those types of locations to work on the merits you chose them for first. Don't mess them up and booger them up by doing some calling, because your calling may be faulty. You may do it too often. I've sat in the woods on public land and heard guys just hit grunt calls every 5 minutes for 2 hours. I mean, and really? You think you're going to call something in like that? It drops your percentages like 90%. So that makes your odds pretty close to 1 to 0% of having anything come. You just don't make a lot of calling. Deer aren't stupid. They live there. They know that is not normal. so only do it a few times and pick your times when you're doing it, pick where you're doing it, and pick how you're doing it. And if you do all that stuff once in a while, you're going to have success. You're going to have something come into it. But if you do it too often, you're going to spook more stuff than you're ever going to call in. I want to thank everybody for watching another episode of Eberhart Outdoors, and please like and subscribe. Shit.
Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe.
Do it again.
Thanks for watching another episode of Eberhart Outdoors, and please like and subscribe.